Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Duke's Bartered Mistress by Caroline Lee. Narrated by Philip Alces. Prologue. To George Stoughton, the Earl of Bonkinbone, October 20th. Dear Sir, cease your attempts to send me money. I do not want it, nor do I want double it, nor triple the amount. As I have told you several times already, you cannot repay your debt with money. I bought your debt because I want one thing from you. Tell me where I can find your brother William. You know as well as I that he left the country at the end of the summer, and I require an address to reach him. Give me that address, and I will erase your debt. Impatiently awaiting your response, Demon Hayle, Baron Edymion. To George Stoughton, the Earl of Bonkinbone, November 2nd. My lord, you will find enclosed your cheque, also a card I had on hand for a physician in London. I cannot personally recommend him, because I have never visited him. I believe he is one of my mother's friends, which is why I had his card in my desk drawer. Clearly you are having some trouble comprehending the written word. Perhaps your vision needs to be checked, or there is some disruption between your eyes and your processing capabilities in your brain. A doctor will hopefully be able to help you. Yet again you have deliberately misunderstood my requirements to erase your not unsubstantial debt. Money will not do. Baron Edymion. To George Stoughton, the Earl of Bonkinbone, November 13th. You complete muffin! Cease, I tell you, cease! You know my demands, clack dish. Your brother's address, a way to contact him abroad, and I will tear up the vouchers I purchased. Edymion. To George Stoughton, the Earl of Bonkinbone, November 24th. Bonkinbone! Wait, let's not be hasty. Call back this representative of yours. I have no need for some pasty, glib-tongued solicitor to traipse up to Scotland. You and I can conduct our business perfectly fine via post. Your representative is not welcome at Edymion, and I'll not listen to any of his offers. Call him back. Demon. Chapter 1. There was no doubt about it. Castle Edymion was cursed. Lady Georgia Stoughton huffed her way up the accursed front steps and glared at the accursed portico protecting the accursedly imposing front door. Curses. Oh, the land was beautiful, even in late November. There was a peaceful air to the way the wind ruffled the dry grasses, and the few leaves left on the trees rustled merrily in the cold afternoon sunshine. Ivy climbed the front of the castle's stone edifice, which didn't seem old enough to be termed a castle. But Edymion must be cursed, the way the townsfolk had whispered. She hadn't been able to convince anyone to drive her, even after thrusting coins in their general direction. So she'd left her trunks at the inn in Banshot and walked here, across the fallow fields and muddy lanes. And now she'd knocked on the imposing front door, and said door had been opened. Well, surely the only reason the creature who opened the door screeched, "Witch!" was because of Georgia's current preoccupation with curses. The giant wart didn't help. "I beg your pardon?" Georgia struggled to maintain her composure. The plump woman shook her head, causing the old-fashioned mop-cap on her head to wobble. "What?" "Which?" Georgia repeated. It was almost comical, the way the woman gasped and clutched at her bosom, gaze darting across the front lawn. "A witch! Witch! Georgia actually turned to follow the woman's gaze before she realized what she was doing and clucked dismissively. "Apologies, madam. Perhaps we can begin again?" The wart on the woman's chin wobbled in time with her mop-cap as she nodded. "Righto." Then she slammed the door. Cursed. Was this reception the reason the townsfolk had refused to drive her to the estate? She'd had no trouble with the train trip to Aberdeen, nor the journey to Banchot. But once settled into the inn, she'd been unable to find a single person willing to drive her out here, each muttering about curses and demons from hell. And despite the cheerful early winter breeze, she was beginning to see their point. Eyes narrowed, she rapped smartly on the front door once more. This time, when the bewarted creature pulled open the door, Georgia didn't give her the opportunity to screech anything. Instead, when she opened her mouth, Georgia forestalled her. "Good afternoon, madam." She tried to wrap herself in the haughtiness her father had drilled into her from a young age. "I am Lady Georgia Stoughton, here to see Baron Edymion. I'm told he's expecting me." The woman blinked. "Nay, you're not." "I am not?" Unconsciously, Georgia's right fingers began plucking at the fine wool of her no longer cream-coloured, thanks to the journey on foot, coat. "You are saying I am not me?" "I'm saying you're not expected. I'm Mrs. Kettle, and I'm only answering the door because the boy is off sleeping somewhere. But I can promise you, lass, the master is not planning on meeting with you." Georgia's mouth opened, then closed again with nothing said. Father's orders had been quite clear. "The Baron must allow me to repay my debt. I have written to him many times and told him to expect you. Do whatever you must to wipe that debt clear, for Danielle's sake." So, Edymion was expecting her. Father had said as much. But this strange woman with the beaming smile and the gap between her teeth and the wart on her chin was just standing there with the door open, telling Georgia she wasn't expected. There was some mistake, that it wasn't hers. Leaning to one side, Georgia tried to peer into the dark interior of the house. "Look, Mrs. Kettle, could you not please take a message to your master? Tell him I am here as a representative of my father, the Earl of Bonkinbone, with whom he has been corresponding." The housekeeper, surely this was a housekeeper, and not a housebreaker, or a squatter, or stranger who had wandered through, merely shifted her ample hips to one side to block Georgia's view of the evidently neglected front hall. "Sorry, dearie." Still grinning, the woman shook her head. "The master's not at home. Not today. Not ever." Frustration mounting, Georgia's fingers curled inside her gloves. "And when will Baron Edymion be at home? I can return then." "Oh, dear, your hearing is broken." The elder woman clucked and shook her head sympathetically, then all but yelled, "Never! He doesn't want visitors." Georgia had to actually back away from the force of the woman's voice, and the spittle. Thank heavens she managed to catch herself before she tumbled down the 3 steps to the gravel front drive, but she wobbled dangerously nonetheless. This wasn't the first time she'd been told the person she was calling upon wasn't at home to her. A scandalous marriage had assured that fact. But it wasn't just her pride at stake now. Danielle's happily ever after rested on her ability to convince Baron Edymion to allow father to repay his debt. So Georgia pulled herself up to her quite inconsequential height and fixed her sternest gaze on the housekeeper. "Madam Kettle, I insist on being allowed to speak with Edymion." "Sorry, milady." The woman shook her head hard enough to cause the mop cap to tumble over one ear. "You'll have to leave." And she shut the door. Again. This time, however, Georgia heard the lock slide into place. And there she stood, on the front steps of Castle Edymion, gazing up at a cursed front door. She'd not only been denied entry, she'd been locked out, as if the strange Mrs. Kettle assumed Georgia would try to push her way in. Well, she should. Father had sent word she'd be arriving. It wasn't as if she'd hurried, no. She'd given the Baron plenty of time to alert his staff to expect her. Perhaps he had. Perhaps that is why the housekeeper shut the door in your face. Georgia huffed and tugged the sleeves of her coat into place, trying to ignore the sour taste of embarrassment in her throat. It really was too bad if the Baron didn't want to allow her into his home. She would meet with him, and she would give him the cheque to cover Father's debt, even if she had to force it between his fingers. There is more than one way into a castle. Right. Tipping her head back, Georgia glared up at the ivy-covered stonework, knowing the so-called castle couldn't be much more than 100 years old. There might not be a portcullis and bailey, but there would most definitely be a back door. A servant's entrance, or a way in through the kitchen gardens would work just as well. Even though she'd walked from Banchard, there was no reason she couldn't walk a bit farther. Once inside, she'd avoid Mrs. Kettle and find the Baron herself. Straightening her shoulders and lifting her chin, Lady Georgia Stoughton marched her way down the steps and toward the back of the house. Her irritation slowly abandoned her as the wind tugged at her hat and tried its best to send icy fingers up her skirts. It also brought the sense of pine and evergreen ferns, which never failed to improve her spirits. As she turned the corner, her march slowing to a stroll, she thought she could detect hints of the herbs which must be planted in the kitchen gardens. Gardens had always been her refuge, and she couldn't deny she was intrigued by the sight of Castle Endymion's overgrown shrubbery, beds full of weeds, and untended lawns. Her fingers itched to attack the out-of-control ivy and lopsided holly, to set some aside for decorations during the coming Christmas celebrations, her favourite time of year. But this wasn't her father's gardens, and she had no right to plunder the clippings. She'd heard the Baron, never terribly sociable, had retired from the public eye 2 years before. Clearly he'd also allowed his estate to go to ruin, which perhaps explained the cursed rumours in the village. Her fingers itched for a pair of shears and a rake. Father had never approved of his eldest daughter working in his gardens like a common labourer, but she still slipped away to her refuge. Her father's gardeners were loyal to her, and wouldn't reveal the fact she occasionally did something as improper as lift a spade. Yes, the gardens might belong to Father, but they were hers in a much realer sense. The man couldn't tell a thistle from a rose. Even now, with the sword of Damocles, otherwise known as her sister's upcoming marriage, dangling over her head, the sight of so many growing things calmed her soul. Although overgrown might be too kind. Clearly Baron Edymion had allowed his estate to go to ruin, but she knew he was here. Before she'd left London, Georgia had done her research. The Baron had been injured in a train fire on the way north to his estate in Scotland, and hadn't left since. There, she'd been correct. Like many other grand homes built at the same time, Castle Edymion had a walled garden tucked up against the lower level, within sight of the stables. She would guess that the kitchen entrance was through that gate, although she couldn't see past the high walls. But as she grew closer, she heard the sound of an axe hacking at wood, intermingled with a man's grunts. A gardener, perhaps, cutting wood for the coming winter? She picked up her pace and came to the open gate in time to hear a sharp twang as the blade hit incorrectly. "Fuck me!" The growl came from the man standing before one of the overgrown climbing roses, although to call him a man would miss the opportunity to call him a hulking beast on 2 legs, or a primitive brute of arousing muscles, or even, dear God, I can see his knees. The man bent, rolled his shoulders, and resettled the axe in his hands. With another growl, really it couldn't be anything but a growl, he began to attack the poor defenceless climbing rose once more. Georgia winced. It was possible he was trying to do something useful, but all she saw was attempted murder. If he continued hacking at the rose, it would severely weaken the plant, no matter how old and established the roots were. She stepped into the garden, preparing to point out the flaws in the poorly trained gardener's technique. But something stopped her. Something. Be honest, it's his legs. Well, yes, it was his legs, but it was rather rude of her subconscious to point that out. Each time the man swung, his kilt would sway against his legs, revealing not just his knees, but tantalizing glimpses of the backs of his thighs. Backs of his thighs is only a few inches from buttocks. I wonder if he's tanned all over. God in heaven, he was beautifully built. The fact he wore below his waist only a rough pair of boots and a kilt made that fact abundantly clear. With that dark hair hanging down around his shoulders, he looked like an ancient Highlander who'd stepped off the pages of one of Georgia's more lurid novels. When she realized her breaths were coming more quickly, and her pulse had picked up pace, she wondered if the book she was thinking of was, in fact, A Harlot's Guide to the Forbidden and Delightful Arts. Another hesitant step forward, then a third. He hadn't turned, but was now grunting with each swing of the axe at that poor plant. She was beginning to realize that the man was too large to be a mere gardener. A woodsman, perhaps, but surely not a villager from Banshot. The man had to be a member of the Edymion estate. And then the axe caught a thick node too close and stuck. "Beetle-headed varlet," he growled, and bent forward to wrench it free. She owed it to the pitiable rosebush to speak up. She had no choice. "Pardon me, but you are doing that incorrectly." When he swung around, axe clutched in his hands and a scowl on his face, Georgia fought the urge to step away from his anger. Actually, she had to fight the urge to turn and run, or possibly scream and hide her head in a hole. The man was beastly. Burns scarred the left side of his face, such that the dark hair swinging about his chin did nothing to hide the damage, and continued under the open collar of the old-fashioned shirt he wore. She blinked in surprise, willing herself not to react to his appearance. "What?" he snarled. It took her a moment to realize he was asking her to repeat herself. So, clearing her throat, Georgia nodded to the rosebush he was currently mutilating. "It is still early in the winter to be pruning, but if you insist upon it, you should be focusing your cuts a few inches from the nodes of the side shoots, not hacking willy-nilly. You're in real danger of damaging the main stem." His hands had tightened around the handle of the axe, and she couldn't help but notice the strength in those fingers, the sheen of sweat along his forearms. He'd removed his coat and waistcoat and rolled up his sleeves, even in the cold November air. A gentle throbbing began between her thighs, and she managed not to groan in irritation. Now? Her carnal urges decided to make themselves known now? Well, he is remarkably well built. Hopefully the woodsman hadn't noticed. Could a man notice? "Who the bloody hell are you?" Oh, good, he hadn't. Georgia drew herself up. "I am the woman who knows how to prune a climbing rose, and understands the propriety of using foul language in front of ladies." "Which is?" he growled. "Oh, dear. Do not do it." With another scowl he dismissed her, turning back to the rosebush. But as he lifted the axe once more, she hurried to forestall him. "I'm looking for the entrance to the kitchens." A door nestled among the overgrown bushes. "Is that it?" "Nay, he grunted, his axe slicing through another of the thick shoots, not looking at her. "That's the hole to the bloody useless conservatory." Another grunt, another chop. Since he was paying her no attention, Georgia moved toward the door. Her interest piqued by the idea of a conservatory, obviously unused, she wondered if she could find her way to Baron Endymion's study from here, before returning to examine the specimens within. She did her best to dismiss the well-built, completely inept woodsman from her mind as she reached for the latch. "Thank you, sir, this will do." But he moved faster and quieter than she thought possible, as evidenced by the large hand that slammed, fingers splayed, on the door in front of her nose. With a strangled yelp, Georgia stumbled backwards, putting space between herself and the large, axe-wielding, half-naked, obviously livid brute. "Why?" he growled. One hand pressed to her chest, where she could feel her heart pounding even through layers of warm wool. Georgia tried to make her voice work. "Why, what?" He leaned toward her, his dark hair swinging forward, partially blocking the scars on his face. For the first time she realized his eyes were a pale green, the color of new shoots, glittering dangerously among the ruin of his expression. "Why do you want to find the kitchens?" She swallowed, willing her knees not to give out from his proximity. Good heavens, she could smell his sweat, which should be disgusting, but somehow wasn't. "I do not need to find the kitchens exactly. I just need to get into the castle." "The house is closed." He was eyeing her guardedly, like he wasn't sure what to make of her. "Always is." That's what Mrs. Kettle at the front door said. And yet... "I need to speak with your master." For the first time, something like surprise flickered across the man's face. "Who?" "I have a meeting with Baron Endymion." And then he snorted, actually snorted, and turned away, axe dangling forgotten in one hand. "Not with a woman who kens about pruning climbing roses," he said, throwing her words back at her while he stalked willy-nilly across the once-manicured garden paths. "Go home." Georgia hurried after him. "No, I must see the Baron. I can pay you." He crossed through a gate into what was obviously the kitchen gardens, judging from the overgrown herbs and empty vegetable patches. "The Baron doesn't see anyone," he called, not looking back as he headed toward a door. Panting now, she gathered up her skirts, desperate not to lose sight of him. "I'm here to pay a debt." "He will nae accept it." "He must." When the brute rounded on her, Georgia was going fast enough she almost barreled into him. But again his reflexes surprised her. In a heartbeat he'd tossed the axe to one side and raised his arms to catch her, his hands closing around her upper arms to steady her. And there she stood, her head tilted back to stare, open-mouthed and suddenly breathless, up at a devil with the body of an angel. "Who are you?" His rasp was harsh, his expression blazing with his irritation. "Georgia," she whispered. His fingers tightened on her arms, and she swore, even through her coat, she could feel his warmth. She should be scared. A man his size could do more than leave bruises. He could break bones. He could kill her, and no one would hear her scream. But this wasn't fear coursing through her veins, oh no. It was desire. For a dirty, sweaty brute of a Scotsman in a kilt. "Lady?" he prompted. Oh, right. He'd asked who she was. She swallowed, trying to make her mind focus. "Lady Georgia Stoughton, daughter to the Earl of Bonkinbone." The scarring on the left side of his face made it difficult to read his expression, but both eyes widened. Cankerous fuckweasel. That's you. Your father said he was sending a representative. He released her and stepped back, shaking his head. And I should have kenned he'd ignore my demands to leave me my privacy. He shook his head again, this time looking almost disgusted. Her eyes had widened as his words sunk in, though she swayed without his support. You are Baron Edymion, the man who holds my father's debt. Pusillanimous cockwomble, he mumbled, before turning once more for what must be the kitchen door. Was it better or worse that she'd caught herself lusting after the very man she'd been sent here to convince? "Wait!" Georgia called, springing after him. "I am here to pay my father's debt." "Nay," he growled, yanking open the door. "You must allow me to pay it. I can authorize the transfer today." Without turning, the Baron spat. "You dinna listen, nay." He disappeared into the dim interior. "Go home, lady." The command drifted from the darkness. Georgia stood there on the step, one hand on the wooden door, listening to his footsteps recede into the kitchen. She glanced over her shoulder at the overgrown garden. Well, here she was at Castle Edymion, and at least she knew who the Baron was. He was rude and curt and used foul language, but when he'd touched her, she hadn't felt fear. Perhaps he could be reasoned with. Her chin rose. Father was counting on her, and she owed him for the way her foolish actions had almost ruined Danielle's chance for a future. She would find a way to pay that debt. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the cursed darkness of Castle Edymion. Chapter 2. What the? She followed him inside. Scowling, Demon slammed down the cup of spring water he'd been drinking from, despite not having yet quenched his thirst or cooled from the exertions in the garden. The roses had become out of control in the past year, and although he knew nothing about gardening, it had seemed easy enough to take out some of his perpetual anger on them. "My lord," began Mrs. Kettle, her sleeves rolled up as she kneaded the dough. "I was going to make mutton for tonight, until Mary reminded me everyone kens mutton's unlucky on a Tuesday." His attention on the hesitant steps of the interloper, Demon didn't reply. Instead, he darted toward the door. Perhaps if he was quick, the woman from the garden wouldn't know which way he'd gone. Toad-spotted turd puffin. What part of, "Nay, you're not welcome here," did she not understand? He could hear her, behind him. Holding his breath, Demon ducked through an open door, hoping she'd pass him by. "Lord Edymion, please wait. Oh, good day, Mrs. Kettle." "And a good day to you, miss. I see you found your way in anyhow. If you're chasing the master, he's the one hiding in my pantry." Demon couldn't help the growl that rose in his throat. "My lord, there's a nice-looking lady out here to see you." Scowling, he stuck his head back out. "I ken that. I'm avoiding her." "Really?" Mrs. Kettle's brows went up, and she wiped at her forehead with her flour-coated forearm. "Seems silly, what with her standing right here." Sure enough, the woman, Stoughton, something or other Stoughton, was trying to hide a smirk. At him. He growled again, then flopped a hand back and forth. Her brow rose. "What are you doing, my lord?" "Wasn't it obvious? I'm trying to shoo you away. Shoo! Leave, you're not wanted here." And now the Stoughton woman was outright smiling as she pulled off her winter gloves and shoved them in the pocket of that fine coat she wore. His housekeeper cook clucked her tongue. "Pay nae mind to the master, dearie. He's a grumpy one. What did you say your name was?" "Lady Georgia Stoughton, daughter to the Earl of Bonkinbone." Mrs. Kettle drew herself up and thrust her hand in the woman's direction.
"Well, la! How do you do, my lady?"
To Demon's surprise, Lady Georgia hesitated only a moment before taking the older woman's hand and giving it a firm, if quick.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?